There is one state in America that has led the nation in poverty for over 100 years. Not for a decade, not for one bad economy, not for one president's term in office. For over a century, through booms and recessions, through war and peace, one state has consistently ranked at the very bottom. This is the story of Mississippi, the poorest state in the United States, and the reasons why, after everything, it still hasn't changed. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell you almost everything before we even get to the history. Mississippi's poverty rate sits close to 19%, the highest of any state in the country. That's roughly 1 in every 5 people living below the federal poverty line. The national average is under 12%. Mississippi isn't just above it, it's been above it for generations, through Republican governors and Democratic governors alike, through oil booms and manufacturing busts, through every economic cycle the rest of the country has gone through. Median household income here is the lowest in the nation, tens of thousands of dollars below the national median. Life expectancy is also the lowest in the country, and infant mortality is the highest. Childhood poverty is worse still, with close to 1 in every 3 children in the state growing up below the poverty line. These aren't separate statistics, they're connected, and they paint the same picture from different angles. A state with a lower median income has less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means less funding for schools and hospitals. Weaker schools and hospitals mean lower life expectancy and lower educational attainment. And lower educational attainment feeds back into lower incomes for the next generation. It's a loop, and it's one this state has been caught inside for longer than any other. So the real question isn't whether Mississippi is poor. Everyone agrees on that. The real question is why, and more importantly, why it hasn't changed. To understand Mississippi, you have to go to one region inside it, the Delta, not the river delta near the Gulf Coast further south. This delta is the flat, low-lying stretch of farmland in the northwest part of the state, sitting between the Mississippi River and the smaller Yazoo River. This is some of the most fertile land in North America. The soil here is deep, dark, and almost perfectly suited for large-scale agriculture. It's also home to some of the poorest counties in the entire United States. That contradiction, extraordinary natural wealth sitting on top of extraordinary human poverty, is the key to understanding almost everything else in this story. For over a century, this land built enormous wealth, just not for the people working it. The Delta's economy was built on cotton, and cotton in this region was built first on enslaved labor and later on a sharecropping system that kept most black families and many poor white families locked into debt to landowners year after year, with almost no path to owning land themselves. When slavery legally ended, the wealth built on it didn't redistribute. The land ownership patterns stayed largely the same. The people who had done the work for generations were left with the least capital, the least land, and the least access to credit to start over on their own terms. That single fact, who owned the land when the rules changed, shaped the next 100 years of this region's economy more than almost anything else. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, farming mechanized. Tractors and mechanical cotton pickers replaced the manual labor that had employed most of the region for 100 years. It happened quickly. In the span of about 2 decades, the vast majority of farm labor jobs in the Delta simply disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of people left the region over the following decades, part of what's known as the Great Migration, heading to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis for factory work. What they left behind were small towns that had been built entirely around an agricultural economy that no longer needed them, and no clear plan for what should replace it. Here's the part of the story that gets less attention. When an economy collapses in a region, the usual expectation, the pattern we see in most of the country, is that something else eventually moves in to replace it. New industry, new investment, new infrastructure. In much of the Mississippi Delta, that didn't happen at anywhere near the scale it did elsewhere. Part of the reason is geography. The Delta has no major interstate hub, no large international airport, and no proximity to a big metro economy to feed off of the way, say, a struggling town outside Atlanta or Charlotte might. Part of it is a slower, more brutal feedback loop. As population declined, the tax base declined with it. A smaller tax base meant less money for schools. Weaker schools made it harder to build a workforce that could attract new employers. And without new employers, there was even less reason for people to stay, which shrank the tax base further. Education is one of the clearest examples of this loop in action. Mississippi has consistently ranked near the bottom nationally in both education funding and outcomes for decades. And the data on this is blunt. Nationally, poverty and low educational attainment move together almost everywhere you look, and Mississippi is one of the clearest, most persistent cases of it in the country. Healthcare tells a nearly identical story. Large parts of the state, especially its rural counties, are what's officially classified as medically underserved, meaning there simply aren't enough doctors, clinics, or hospital beds for the population that lives there. Several rural hospitals in Mississippi have closed in the last 2 decades, and more are considered financially at risk today. When a rural hospital closes, it doesn't just remove healthcare access, it removes jobs, it removes a reason for a doctor or nurse to live nearby, and it makes the entire county harder to live in for anyone managing a chronic illness, raising young children, or simply getting older. It would be easy to think of this as only a Delta problem. It isn't. Poverty in Mississippi is spread across rural counties throughout the entire state. In the hill country to the east, along parts of the Gulf Coast that are still recovering from hurricane damage going back to Katrina in 2005, and in small towns across the state that lost their one major employer, whether that was a furniture plant, a textile mill, or a shipyard, and never fully replaced it. What connects almost all of these places is the same underlying pattern: a local economy that depended heavily on a single industry and no real contingency plan for what happens when that industry shrinks or leaves entirely. In one county, it's cotton. In another, it's a single factory that employed half the town. In a third, it's the fishing and shipbuilding industry along the coast, still rebuilding 2 decades after a storm most of the country has stopped thinking about. This pattern is not unique to Mississippi. It's the same story that plays out across much of the rural South and, in a different form, across the industrial Rust Belt further north. Mississippi is simply the place where it shows up most severely, most consistently, and for the longest period of time, because when the state's core industries declined, it had the least economic diversity of any state to fall back on. So, what's actually being done about all of this? There have been real, tangible efforts. Federal and state programs have funneled money into rural broadband expansion, healthcare access grants, and small business development across Delta counties over the past several years, closing some of the gap in internet access that had locked entire towns out of remote work and online education. Community development financial institutions, organizations built specifically to lend in areas traditional banks tend to avoid, have expanded their presence in the region, providing small loans to farmers and entrepreneurs who couldn't get financing anywhere else. A small but real return migration trend has also been documented in recent years, with some people moving back to reconnect with family land, care for aging relatives, or take advantage of new remote work opportunities that didn't exist a generation ago. But these efforts are competing against decades, in some cases well over a century, of underinvestment, and progress has been slow and deeply uneven across the state. Some counties have seen modest, measurable improvement over the last 10 years. Others have continued to lose population, and with it, tax base, school enrollment, and basic services at almost the same rate as before. The honest answer is that there's no single fix, because there was never a single cause. It took well over 100 years of compounding disadvantage. Land ownership, mechanization, migration, underfunded schools, hospital closures, each one layering on top of the last to create the map we're looking at today. Reversing something built over a century doesn't happen inside a single grant program, a single infrastructure bill, or a single election cycle. It takes sustained investment, sustained attention, and frankly, sustained public awareness, which is part of why so few people outside the South even know the details of this story. Mississippi isn't poor because of one policy, one storm, or one decade. It's the result of a system that concentrated wealth and land ownership for over a century, then removed the jobs that land depended on almost overnight and never fully replaced them with anything else. It's easy to look at a map like this and see only red counties and percentage points, but every red county on this screen is a town, a school, a hospital that may or may not still be open, and a few 100,000 people trying to build a life in the place where they were born, often the same place their grandparents and great-grandparents worked the same land. Mississippi isn't alone in this. Right next door, two more states carry some of the same weight, shaped by very similar histories. That's where we're going next. If you want to understand the rest of the map, subscribe, because we're not done yet. There are 49 more states to go, and every one of them has a story the numbers alone don't tell.